Thunder rolled across the alien sky as rain pelted the crystalline walls of the Galactic Council chambers, each droplet creating ripples of light that danced through the massive dome overhead like liquid starfire spreading through space itself. Lord. Caven stretched his four massive arms and flexed claws that could tear through starship hull plating as easily as paper, his predatory instincts telling him that today would bring fresh entertainment in the form of another species, begging for mercy they did not deserve and would not receive from his kind. The Drakthul had ruled this sector of the galaxy for over 3,000 years through simple principles that had never failed them. The strong consumed the weak. Mercy was a luxury that evolution did not permit, and fear was the most reliable currency in any transaction between civilized beings who understood their place in the natural order. His massive form dominated the obsidian throne that had been carved from a single asteroid and polished smooth by the bones of countless species that had knelt before it, seeking protection only to find themselves classified as livestock instead of allies worth preserving for future cooperation. Counselor Mirren approached with her usual graceful steps that barely made sound against the polished floor, her 6 limbs moving in perfect coordination as she carried the daily reports of petitions from various species throughout this arm of the spiral galaxy, where civilizations rose and fell according to his whims alone. Another delegation awaits. Your judgment, Great Lord, she announced with the practiced neutrality that all council members had learned to adopt when presenting potentially volatile situations that might trigger his legendary temper and result in immediate extermination. Orders for entire star systems. Caven's 4 eyes, each larger than most species' heads and capable of detecting movement across vast distances in complete darkness, focused on the sealed entrance where his next entertainment waited behind reinforced doors that could withstand direct hits from military-grade plasma cannons designed for siege warfare. What manner of creatures dare interrupt my contemplation today? He rumbled, his voice carrying undertones that made the crystalline walls vibrate with harmonics that most organic beings found deeply unsettling and often caused immediate submission responses in prey. Species evolved to recognize predator vocalizations. They call themselves humans, Mirren replied, consulting the datapad that contained preliminary scans and assessments of the species requesting audience, though she already knew that such information rarely influenced Lord Caven's decisions, which were based more on instinct than analysis. From the outer spiral arm, specifically, a small blue world they designate as Earth in their primitive language system, that appears to lack the complex harmonic structures found in more evolved civilizations throughout this region of space, where proper communication requires multiple vocal cords working in synchronized harmony. Caven's laugh was like an earthquake-given voice, deep and rumbling and filled with malicious amusement that spoke of eons spent watching lesser species prostrate themselves before superior beings who held their fates in clawed hands, capable of crushing diamond with casual pressure applied through evolutionary advantages earned over millions of years. Humans. He repeated the word as if testing how it felt against his tongue, which was capable of tasting chemical signatures in the air that could reveal fear and desperation from distances that most species would consider impossible using only natural, sensory equipment refined through countless generations of successful hunting. Let me guess their pathetic story before they even speak. Their homeworld faces some threat they cannot handle with their primitive technology. They offer tribute and servitude in exchange for protection they have not earned, and they believe their lives have value simply because they exist rather than because they serve some useful purpose. The great predator lord rose from his throne with movements that seemed deceptively slow but covered ground with shocking speed, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to swallow light itself as he prepared to receive yet another delegation of prey animals who thought words could substitute for strength. Bring them in, he commanded with casual authority that had never been questioned in living memory. But first, tell me what preliminary scans revealed about their physical capabilities, so I know whether they might provide decent sport or merely serve as convenient sustenance for my warriors who grow restless between proper battles. Mirren activated the holographic display that showed detailed biological analysis of the human specimens waiting outside, their readings appearing as streams of data that painted a picture of remarkable physical weakness compared to most spacefaring species that had achieved interstellar travel through their own efforts rather than luck. Bipedal, averaging 6 feet, in height with minimal natural armory, no claws or fangs worth mentioning, primitive sensory equipment that cannot function in complete darkness, and physical strength ratings that fall well below galactic standard minimums for species capable of defending themselves against even basic predators. They have no natural armor plating, their bones are hollow and fragile, they require constant temperature regulation to survive, and their reaction times are so poor that most combat scenarios would end before they could even perceive the threat approaching from standard attack vectors used by competent military forces. Kaven's predatory smile revealed rows of teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone, each one capable of puncturing starship hull plating and holding prey, while venom injected through specialized glands paralyzed victims without killing them immediately, allowing for extended feeding sessions that maintained freshness. Perfect. He growled with satisfaction that made the chamber's air seem thicker and harder to breathe. Another species that achieved spaceflight through accident rather than evolution, probably discovered by some other civilization, and given technology they could never have developed independently, using their own limited intellectual capacity. The massive doors began to open with hydraulic systems that could move barriers weighing several tons as if they were made of paper, revealing the human delegation that stood trembling in the anteroom where they had waited for this audience, that would determine whether their species lived or died. 3 adult humans entered first, their movements betraying the terror they tried, desperately to hide behind diplomatic protocols they hoped would somehow protect them from a predator whose species had never negotiated with prey, except to determine the most efficient methods of consumption. Behind them came something that made Kaven pause in his assessment. A small human child, perhaps 8 years old by their species standards, clutching something small and furry against her chest with the desperate intensity of a creature protecting its most precious possession from forces beyond its understanding. Fascinating, the Predator Lord mused aloud, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his loudest roars ever could. They bring their young to witness their own species' subjugation, or perhaps they offer the child as tribute, thinking such gestures might inspire mercy in beings who view compassion as evolutionary weakness. The lead human, a middle-aged male whose scent betrayed absolute terror despite his attempts to appear calm and diplomatic, stepped forward with the careful movements of prey, trying not to trigger a predator's strike reflex through sudden motion or aggressive posturing. "Great Lord Kaven," he began with a voice that shook despite obvious efforts at control. "I am Ambassador David Chen, representing the United Earth Government and all human colonies throughout our local star cluster that have banded together in hopes of surviving the crisis that threatens our very existence. We come before your wisdom seeking not charity, but partnership, offering whatever resources and services our species might provide in exchange for protection from forces that have already consumed 17 of our outer colonies, and show no signs of slowing their advance toward our homeworld, where billions of innocents await whatever fate the galaxy decides for them." Kaven descended the steps of his throne platform with deliberate slowness, each footfall echoing through the chamber like the heartbeat of some massive beast preparing to feed, his forearms spreading wide in a gesture that seemed welcoming but served primarily to display the full extent of his physical dominance over the tiny creatures before him. Partnership. He repeated the word as if it were some foreign concept that required translation into a language he could understand. What could creatures such as yourselves possibly offer to beings who have conquered star systems while your species was still learning to make fire in primitive caves on your insignificant little world? You speak of protection as if it were some commodity to be traded, rather than a privilege to be earned through strength and cunning that your kind clearly lacks. Given that you stand here begging rather than fighting whatever threatens you with the determination of a species worthy of survival. The human child behind the adults began to make soft crying sounds that seemed to amuse the Predator Lord even more than the diplomatic platitudes her elders offered, her small frame shaking with fear that was so pure and primitive that it awakened hunting instincts that had been dormant during this morning's tedious administrative duties. "Look at this tiny thing." Kaven laughed with genuine delight. his attention focusing on the child with the intensity of a laser targeting system locking onto its chosen victim. She weeps already, and we have not even begun the preliminary evaluation process that determines which members of petitioning species might serve useful purposes. His massive head lowered until his burning eyes were level with the terrified child, and his breath washed over her like sulfurous wind from volcanic vents that could kill most organic life through toxic inhalation alone. Yet she remained conscious through what must have been sheer terror-induced paralysis. "Tell me, little morsel," he whispered with mock gentleness that somehow contained more cruelty than outright threats ever could. "What is that small creature you clutch so desperately? And do you think it will provide comfort when the culling begins and the weak are separated from those who might prove useful enough to justify the resources required for basic survival?" Purple lightning crackled across the vast expanse of space, visible through the dome's transparent ceiling, while Lord Caven's attention remained fixed on the small bundle clutched against the human child's chest like a lifeline, thrown to someone drowning in an ocean of terror and despair that threatened to consume her entirely. The tiny creature appeared to be sleeping peacefully despite the chaos and fear surrounding it, its small body rising and falling with steady breaths that seemed impossibly calm, given the predatory presence that loomed over them like death itself, waiting for the perfect moment to strike with claws that had ended civilization's ambassador. David's hands trembled as he watched the massive predator lord examine his daughter Lucy, with the clinical interest of a biologist studying specimens that might provide useful data before being dissected for research purposes that would benefit more evolved species worthy of such knowledge. "The child's companion is merely a domestic animal from our homeworld," David said carefully, each word chosen with desperate precision as he tried to navigate diplomatic waters that seemed filled with invisible minds, capable of destroying everything he hoped to protect through this dangerous gamble. "We call them cats, small predators that evolved alongside humans in a symbiotic relationship that has lasted for thousands of years, though they retain many of their wild instincts, despite generations of selective breeding that has made them suitable companions for civilized society." Caven's laugh rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder promising storms that could shatter worlds and leave only dust, where once proud civilizations had built monuments to their achievements that now meant nothing to beings capable of erasing them with casual thoughts. "A predator," he mused with amusement, that carried undertones of mockery deep enough to drown species in shame and humiliation that would follow them through whatever afterlife awaited beings too weak to deserve better fates than serving as entertainment for their superiors. "This tiny thing is supposed to be a predator. It is smaller than my smallest claw, and appears to lack any natural weapons that could threaten even the most defenseless prey animals that exist in the wild spaces between stars, where survival depends entirely on evolutionary advantages earned through millions of years of successful adaptation." The Great Lord circled the human delegation with movements that seemed casual, but maintained perfect positioning for striking, at any angle that circumstances might require, his forearms moving in subtle patterns that kept multiple attack vectors open simultaneously, according to combat protocols that had never failed him. "Your species," he continued with the patient tone of a teacher instructing particularly slow students in lessons they should have learned before presuming to waste his valuable time with their pathetic requests for assistance they had not earned through any display of worthwhile capabilities. "Claims partnership with predators while demonstrating physical weakness that suggests you would serve better as prey for genuine hunters who understand the natural order that governs all existence in this galaxy, where strength determines survival, and mercy is a luxury that evolution cannot afford to permit." Lucy looked up at the towering alien with eyes that held something besides fear, a quality that seemed strange and out of place in someone so young and helpless, when faced with forces that could extinguish her existence with less effort than most beings expended on breathing air or processing nutrients. "Rusty protects our house from mice and rats," she said softly, her voice carrying across the vast chamber with surprising clarity despite her obvious terror. "He's really good at hunting them, even though he likes to sleep most of the time and play with his toys when he thinks nobody is watching him." Sometimes I find dead birds and mice by our door because he brings them as presents to show that he loves us and wants to share his success as a hunter, even though I wish he would just bring flowers or something that wouldn't make Daddy have to clean up the mess." The Predator Lord's massive head tilted slightly as he processed this information through intellectual frameworks designed for analyzing potential threats and opportunities that might prove useful for expanding his empire's influence throughout regions of space, where resistant species required careful evaluation before decisions about their ultimate fate. Love. Caven repeated the concept as if it were some alien technology that required reverse engineering to understand its function and potential applications in scenarios where emotional manipulation might prove more effective than direct force in achieving desired outcomes. Your tiny predator brings you the corpses of its kills as gifts, demonstrating hunting success while maintaining proximity to larger beings who could easily destroy it if they chose to do so. Yet it continues this behavior because of emotional attachment rather than fear or survival necessity. His 4 eyes studied the sleeping cat with renewed interest that went beyond casual amusement, focusing on details that his initial assessment had dismissed as irrelevant, but which now seemed to contain information that might require more careful analysis before reaching final conclusions about this species' true nature. "Explain this relationship," he commanded with authority that made the crystalline walls vibrate in harmony with frequencies that most organic beings found deeply unsettling. How does a predator species choose to live symbiotically with prey animals instead of simply consuming them when resources become scarce or territory disputes arise? David swallowed hard before answering, knowing that his next words might determine whether humanity survived this encounter or joined the countless species that had been classified as useful only for their protein content and mineral resources that could feed Caven's expanding military. Machine cats were never truly domesticated in the way that other animals were bred for specific purposes, he explained with the careful precision of someone walking through a minefield, where one wrong step could trigger explosions that would consume everything he held dear. They chose to live with us because mutual cooperation provided advantages for both species. They received reliable food sources and safe shelter, while we benefited from their natural hunting abilities that kept our food supplies free from pests that could cause disease and starvation. Over thousands of years, this partnership evolved into genuine emotional bonds that go beyond simple transactional relationships, creating connections based on affection and loyalty that persist even when practical benefits might suggest other arrangements would be more efficient from purely survival-oriented perspectives. Lord Caven's predatory smile revealed rows of teeth that could puncture starship armor, each one designed through evolutionary processes that had refined his species into perfect killing machines, capable of dominating any environment they encountered throughout their expansion across stellar territories. Emotional bonds with predators, he mused aloud while studying the small creature that continued sleeping peacefully, despite being surrounded by forces that could end its existence faster than its primitive nervous system could register the threat approaching from multiple vectors simultaneously. And these predators choose to remain with your species rather than seeking independence that would allow them to follow their natural instincts without constraints imposed by association with beings they could easily abandon, if circumstances changed in ways that made continued cooperation disadvantageous. Lucy's small hand gently stroked the orange and white fur of her sleeping companion, while she nodded with the simple honesty of a child who had never learned that truth could be dangerous when dealing with beings whose moral frameworks operated according to principles that prioritized strength over compassion. Rusty could leave any time he wanted, she said with absolute certainty that seemed to surprise the adults around her who understood better than she did how precarious their situation had become. But he stays because he loves us and we love him, and that makes us family even though we're different species. When I'm sad, he comes and sits on my lap and purrs until I feel better. And when he's sick, I take care of him and give him medicine even though he doesn't like it, because that's what families do for each other when somebody needs help. The massive predator lord fell silent as he processed concepts that seemed to challenge fundamental assumptions about how intelligent species interacted when survival pressures required difficult choices between self-interest and group loyalty. that most civilizations resolved through dominance hierarchies. Something about the child's simple explanation of interspecies, emotional bonds struck against intellectual barriers that had protected his worldview from questions that might undermine the philosophical foundations upon which his empire had been built through conquest and subjugation, rather than cooperation and mutual respect. In that moment of contemplation, while alien storms raged beyond the dome and the sleeping cat continued its peaceful slumber despite being surrounded by forces that represented existential threats to everything it had ever known or loved, Lord Caven began to wonder if there might be forms of strength that his species had never learned to recognize or value. Silence stretched through the chamber like a living thing with weight and substance, while the storm outside painted shifting patterns of light across surfaces that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations too numerous to count. In the long history of galactic dominance that Lord Caven's species had maintained through principles that seemed suddenly less certain than they had moments before. The small cat named Rusty continued sleeping in Lucy's arms despite the tension that crackled through the air like electricity seeking ground through any available conductor, his peaceful breathing creating a rhythm that seemed impossibly calm, given the predatory presence that loomed over them all like a mountain of scales and claws. Lord Caven found himself studying the tiny creature with growing fascination that went beyond his usual assessment of potential prey animals or useful resources that might serve his empire's expansion throughout regions of space where resistance required careful consideration of tactical advantages and strategic vulnerabilities. Something about the cat's complete relaxation in the face of obvious danger suggested either profound stupidity or confidence so absolute that it bordered on arrogance, qualities that seemed contradictory in an animal that the humans claimed was a successful predator, despite its diminutive size and apparent helplessness. Ambassador David watched the alien lord's expression change subtly as minutes passed without the expected declarations of judgment that would determine humanity's fate in this galaxy, where survival depended entirely on the whims of beings whose power could reshape solar systems according to desires that lesser species could never hope to understand or influence. Great Lord, David ventured carefully, knowing that interrupting Caven's contemplation could prove fatal, but also recognizing that prolonged silence might be interpreted as weakness or disrespect by beings whose cultures valued direct communication over diplomatic subtlety. If I may ask what troubles you about our companion animals, perhaps we could provide additional information that would clarify any misconceptions or concerns that might influence your decision regarding our petition for protection against the Silicon Horde's advancing forces. The massive predator lords, four eyes refocused on the human delegation with intensity that made the air seem thicker and harder to breathe, as if his attention alone could alter atmospheric pressure through sheer force of will, concentrated into beams of awareness that missed nothing. What troubles me? Caven said slowly, his voice carrying undertones that suggested thoughts moving in directions he had never explored before, encountering concepts that challenged assumptions built over millennia of unquestioned dominance. Is that your tiny predator chooses to sleep rather than flee when confronted with a threat that could eliminate it without effort, suggesting either complete trust in your ability to provide protection or confidence in its own capabilities that seems entirely unjustified by observable evidence. His massive form moved closer to the child and her sleeping companion, each step calculated to avoid triggering flight responses while maintaining positioning that would allow immediate action if circumstances required swift resolution of potential threats to his authority or safety. In my experience, he continued with the patient tone of someone working through complex problems that required careful analysis before reaching conclusions that might have far-reaching consequences for multiple species throughout this sector of the galaxy. Predators do not sleep in the presence of superior hunters unless they possess hidden advantages that are not immediately apparent to casual observation, or unless they have evolved behavioral patterns that serve purposes beyond simple survival instincts that govern most organic life forms. Lucy looked up at the towering alien with eyes that held more curiosity than fear now, as if his obvious interest in her pet had somehow transformed him from a monster into merely a very large and dangerous person who might be reasoned with if approached correctly. Rusty isn't afraid because he knows I won't let anything hurt him, she said with the absolute confidence of childhood that had never been taught to doubt the protective power of love and loyalty between beings who had chosen to share their lives despite obvious differences. And he protects me too when there are scary things like thunderstorms or strange noises at night, so we take care of each other because that's what friends do, even when one of us is bigger or stronger or better at different things. The Great Lord's predatory smile faded as he processed this explanation through intellectual frameworks that had been designed for analyzing threats and opportunities rather than emotional relationships that persisted without obvious benefits to either party involved in maintaining such connections. Mutual protection between beings of vastly different capabilities, he mused aloud, while his advanced senses detected subtle changes in atmospheric composition that suggested the approaching storm system contained unusual energy patterns that might affect local gravitational fields. Yet your small predator appears to offer nothing that you could not accomplish more effectively through technological solutions or alliance with species better equipped to provide meaningful assistance in scenarios where survival depends on superior firepower or tactical advantages. David exchanged glances with his fellow diplomats before responding with words that he hoped would somehow bridge the gap between species whose worldviews seemed separated by evolutionary chasms too wide for conventional communication to span effectively. With respect, Great Lord, you're measuring value in terms that don't account for qualities that can't be quantified through standard analysis methods used for evaluating military assets or strategic resources that serve purely functional purposes. The bond between humans and cats developed over thousands of years through countless small interactions that created trust and affection, strong enough to survive changes in circumstances that might otherwise end relationships based solely on practical considerations, as if responding to some signal that only it could detect. The small cat began to stir in Lucy's arms, its orange and white fur shifting as muscles moved beneath skin that seemed impossibly soft and vulnerable compared to the armored hides that protected most spacefaring species from environmental hazards. Lord Caven's attention focused with laser intensity on this development as the tiny creature's ears twitched once, then twice, suggesting awareness levels that contradicted its previously passive state during what should have been a terrifying encounter with beings capable of ending its existence through casual gestures. The cat's eyes opened slowly with deliberate precision that seemed more calculated than the sleepy awakening, typical of domestic animals roused from comfortable naps, revealing golden irises that reflected light with qualities that made them seem almost luminous in the chamber's artificial illumination. Those eyes turned immediately toward Lord Caven with focus so direct and unwavering that the massive predator, Lord, felt something he had not experienced in over 2 millennia of conquest and domination across star systems, where his word was absolute law enforced through overwhelming superiority. The cat's gaze held intelligence that seemed far older and deeper than its small brain should have been capable of containing, as if millions of years of evolutionary refinement had compressed the essence of perfect predation into a form so compact and efficient that size became irrelevant to effectiveness. Every muscle in the tiny creature's body coiled with potential, energy that spoke of capabilities hidden beneath an appearance designed to deceive prey into underestimating threats until it was far too late for escape or defense against hunting techniques perfected over geological timescales. Lord Caven found himself taking an involuntary step backward, as primitive instincts older than civilization screamed warnings about dangers that his conscious mind could not yet identify or categorize according to threat assessment protocols that had never failed him when dealing with conventional predators. The cat's pupils dilated to perfect circles of darkness while its ears flattened against its skull in a gesture that every prey species throughout the galaxy would recognize as the final warning before death came on silent paws with claws extended for the killing strike. In that moment of perfect stillness before violence erupted, the great predator lord of the Apex Legion realized that he might have seriously misjudged this species and their mysterious companions who carried within themselves secrets that could reshape his understanding of what it truly meant to be apex predators in a galaxy full of surprises. Deep beneath the conscious layers of Lord Caven's mind, genetic memories that had been dormant since his species first crawled from primordial oceans suddenly awakened with alarm signals that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at survival instincts that had kept his ancestors alive when being apex predators meant nothing against forces that operated according to rules older than civilizations. The small cat rose to its feet with fluid grace that seemed to defy physics, every movement economical and precise as if it had been designed by evolution itself to achieve maximum efficiency with minimum energy expenditure, creating the impression of coiled springs, waiting for the perfect moment to release devastating force. Rusty's golden eyes never wavered from Lord Caven's massive form, as the tiny predator assessed threats and opportunities with calculating intelligence that seemed impossibly vast for a brain weighing less than most species' fingernails, yet carried within itself the distilled wisdom of countless successful hunts spanning geological ages. The great lord of the Apex Legion found himself frozen by recognition of something he had never encountered before. A creature so perfectly evolved for killing that size became irrelevant compared to the pure essence of predation made manifest in a form that could move through environments where larger hunters would be clumsy and ineffective. "Impossible," whispered Counselor Mirren from her position near the chamber's edge, her compound eyes detecting movement patterns that suggested this small Earth creature possessed reflexes operating at frequencies that most spacefaring species would require. "Technological enhancement to achieve. The biometric readings we took during initial scanning must have been inaccurate somehow because this level of neuromuscular coordination should not be possible in an unmodified organic life form developed on a primitive world without access to genetic engineering technologies." But Lord Caven's attention remained locked on those golden eyes that seemed to look directly into his soul and find it wanting according to standards that had nothing to do with technological advancement or military conquest, but rather measured worth through qualities his species had never learned to value or understand. The cat's tail began moving in patterns that triggered recognition responses buried so deeply in genetic memory that they predated language and civilization, speaking directly to parts of the brain responsible for identifying immediate threats to survival that required instant response or inevitable death. Every predator species represented in the Galactic Council chamber began showing signs of profound unease as primitive warning systems activated across evolutionary lines that had diverged millions of years ago, but still shared common responses to certain universal signals that transcended cultural or biological differences. Rusty's ears flattened, completely against his skull while his pupils expanded to absorb maximum available light for vision systems that had been refined through countless generations of nocturnal hunting, where success meant survival and failure meant starvation in environments that showed no mercy to imperfect predators. From deep within his compact chest came a sound that had not been heard in these halls of power for millennia. The low, rumbling growl of Earth's most efficient killing machine, expressing displeasure with circumstances that threatened something under its protection according to instincts that recognized no authority except the ancient laws of survival. The growl carried harmonics that spoke to genetic memories shared by every creature that had ever been prey, frequencies that triggered immediate flight responses in beings whose ancestors had learned to recognize this particular warning as the last sound they would hear. If they failed to escape immediately, Lord Caven felt his 4 hearts beating faster as adrenaline analogs flooded his system with chemicals designed to prepare his massive frame for combat against opponents who posed genuine threats to his continued existence, something he had not experienced since achieving dominance over this sector of space. "The sound," he whispered with growing amazement as understanding began to penetrate consciousness that had been shaped by eons of unquestioned superiority over beings who feared his presence rather than challenging it with confidence born from absolute certainty in their own lethal capabilities. That is not mere territorial display or defensive posturing designed to frighten away potential threats through intimidation alone, but rather the authentic voice of a creature that has never needed to bluff, because it possesses the genuine ability to back up every threat with lethal action. His massive claws extended involuntarily as instincts older than memory prepared his body for battle, while his conscious mind struggled to process the reality that he was looking at perfection, distilled into its most efficient form by evolution that had created the ultimate predator. Rusty's growl deepened as his claws emerged. With deliberate precision, each one curved like a miniature scimitar designed for specific purposes that required no explanation. To beings who understood the relationship between form and function, in creatures built for killing with maximum efficiency. The tiny weapons gleamed with sharpness that seemed impossible for natural keratin structures, yet reflected light in patterns that suggested molecular arrangements optimized for penetrating armor and severing vital connections with surgical precision that would end resistance before victims realized they were under attack. "Ambassador David," Lord Caven said slowly without taking his eyes off the small predator that continued assessing him with calculations that seemed to involve factors beyond simple threat evaluation. "Explain to me how your species achieved symbiosis with creatures that appear to be designed by some malevolent genius as the perfect killing machines." David swallowed hard as he watched his daughter's pet transform from sleepy house cat into something that made the most dangerous predators in known space take defensive postures while backing away from threats they instinctively recognized as potentially lethal, despite obvious size disadvantages. "We didn't domesticate them," he admitted with honesty that seemed dangerous but necessary given the circumstances that had developed beyond anything diplomatic training could have prepared him for. "They chose to live with us because the arrangement benefited both species, without requiring either to surrender their essential nature. Cats remained hunters while humans provided stable food sources and shelter, creating partnerships based on mutual respect rather than dominance relationships that characterize most interspecies interactions throughout the galaxy, where superior force typically determines which beings serve and which ones rule." Lucy's small hand continued stroking Rusty's fur with gentle movements that seemed to calm the ancient predator, while she spoke with the simple wisdom that only children possessed before learning that truth could be dangerous when dealing with beings whose worldviews could not accommodate concepts that challenged their fundamental assumptions. "He's not mean," she said softly, while golden eyes continued measuring Lord Caven for weaknesses that could be exploited if circumstances required immediate action to protect the small human who had earned loyalty through years of kindness and mutual affection. "He just doesn't like it when someone scares his family because that's his job to keep us safe, just like it's our job to keep him safe and happy and healthy so we can all live together and take care of each other, no matter what happens." The chamber fell into profound silence, broken only by the rumbling growl that seemed to fill the vast space with frequencies that made crystalline walls vibrate in harmony, with sounds that spoke directly to evolutionary memories shared by every predator species that had ever existed. Lord Caven realized with growing amazement that he was witnessing something unprecedented in his long experience. A creature so supremely confident in its abilities that it felt no need to flee from opponents thousands of times its size because it knew with absolute certainty that size meant nothing when skill and determination were refined to perfection. Understanding crashed over Lord Caven like a tsunami of realization that swept away thousands of years of assumptions about strength and dominance and what it truly meant to be an apex predator in a universe full of beings who had mistaken size and technology for genuine evolutionary superiority. The small cat named Rusty remained poised in perfect balance while his golden eyes continued their relentless assessment of threats and opportunities. Every fiber of his being focused on the protection of creatures who had earned his loyalty through qualities that the great predator lord was only beginning to comprehend. In that moment of crystalline clarity, Caven recognized that he was looking at something his species had never encountered before, a being that had achieved perfection not through conquest or domination, but through symbiotic partnership with creatures who offered love instead of fear as the foundation for cooperation. "I have been a fool," the massive alien said slowly, his voice carrying none of its earlier arrogance as humility replaced the certainty that had guided his actions through millennia of galactic expansion, built on principles that suddenly seemed primitive compared to the wisdom displayed by these unlikely allies. "For 3,000 years my people have ruled through strength alone, believing that fear was the most reliable currency for maintaining order throughout territories that spanned star systems, where resistance meant death and submission meant survival under our protection." His forearms lowered in gestures that spoke of respect rather than dominance, while his predatory stance shifted toward something that approached diplomacy. for perhaps the first time in his long existence as the supreme authority over countless species who had learned to tremble at his name. Yet here before me stands a creature weighing less than my smallest claw, who demonstrates confidence so absolute that it feels no need to flee from opponents capable of destroying it instantly, because it possesses something my species has never understood or valued sufficiently to seek. Rusty's growl softened slightly, as sensitive ears detected changes in vocal patterns that suggested shifting intentions among potential threats, though his alert posture remained unchanged and his claws stayed extended as insurance against misreading diplomatic signals that could prove fatal to those under his protection. Lord Caven slowly lowered himself until his massive head was level with the small predator, bringing his 4 burning eyes within range of claws that could blind him before his reflexes could respond to attacks launched from distances that made conventional defense impossible. You fight not for territory or resources or dominance over other predators, he said with growing wonder, as puzzle pieces fell into place to reveal pictures that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of true strength. You fight for love freely given by beings who trust you completely, despite your capacity for violence, and that trust has transformed you into something far more dangerous than any weapon my species has ever created, because you cannot be bribed or intimidated or reasoned with when protecting those you have chosen to guard. Ambassador David watched, in amazement as the most feared predator lord in known space began to understand concepts that human civilization had taken millennia to develop through countless generations of partnership with creatures who had taught them that true strength came not from domination but from bonds forged in mutual respect and affection. Great Lord, David said carefully as he sensed an opportunity to bridge gaps between species whose worldviews had seemed impossibly distant moments before. If you truly wish to understand the relationship between humans and cats, perhaps you should know that we never conquered them or forced them into servitude through superior technology or military force. They came to us during our earliest agricultural periods when we needed protection from rodents that threatened food supplies essential for survival, and they provided that protection in exchange for nothing more than shelter and regular meals that freed them from the uncertainty of hunting in territories where prey animals were becoming scarce. Lucy looked up at the massive alien lord with eyes that no longer held terror but rather the curious interest of a child who had realized that even very large and scary-looking beings could learn new things when they were willing to listen with open minds. Rusty doesn't stay with us because he has to, she explained with the patient tone of someone teaching important lessons to adults who sometimes needed help understanding simple truths. He stays because he wants to be part of our family, and we want him to be part of our family too. Sometimes, he brings us dead mice because he thinks we might be hungry, and he wants to share his food with us the same way we share our food with him when he's hungry, even though we don't really want to eat dead mice because that's not what humans like to eat. The great predator lord's expression shifted through emotions that seemed foreign to features designed for intimidation rather than contemplation as he processed information that challenged fundamental assumptions about how intelligent species interacted when survival pressures required cooperation instead of competition. Partnership. Caven repeated the word with new understanding, as neural pathways that had been dormant since his youth began forming connections between concepts that his education had never encouraged him to explore. Not servitude or dominance, but genuine cooperation between beings who choose to share their lives despite obvious differences in capabilities and evolutionary backgrounds. Rusty's golden eyes remained fixed on the massive alien, while his tail continued its hypnotic movements that spoke to instincts older than language. But the intensity of his growl decreased as sensitive hearing detected subtle changes in vocal harmonics that suggested reduced threat levels among potential adversaries. Your tiny companion has shown me something that threatens the very foundations upon which my empire was built. Lord Caven continued with honesty that surprised even himself as he spoke truths that could undermine his authority if they reached ears belonging to beings who might interpret such admissions as weakness rather than wisdom. He has demonstrated that there exist forms of strength that cannot be measured through conventional metrics used for evaluating military assets or strategic advantages, forces that operate according to principles my species dismissed as evolutionary dead ends, because they seemed to offer no tactical benefits in scenarios where survival depended on superior firepower. The storm outside began to fade as alien weather patterns shifted toward calmer configurations that allowed clearer views of star fields where countless civilizations pursued their destinies, according to laws that governed interaction between species whose differences seemed insurmountable, until viewed through perspectives that valued cooperation over conquest. I formally withdraw my earlier assessment of your species as potential prey animals, suitable only for consumption or servitude, the Great Lord announced with authority, that carried throughout the chamber and beyond to recording devices that would transmit his words across networks spanning multiple star systems. Humanity and their predator companions represent something unprecedented in galactic history, a symbiotic relationship that has produced benefits for both species without requiring either to surrender their essential nature or submit to dominance hierarchies that characterize most interspecies interactions. Furthermore, I hereby grant full protection of the Apex Legion to all human territories threatened by the Silicon Horde, or any other hostile forces that seek to destroy civilizations capable of forming bonds strong enough to inspire such absolute loyalty in beings who possess the power to kill but choose instead to love. Ambassador David felt tears streaming down his face as relief flooded through him with intensity that made his knees weak, while Lucy giggled with pure joy as she hugged Rusty closer to her chest, and the small predator finally allowed his claws to retract. "But I must ask one favor in return," Lord Caven added with humility that transformed his terrifying features into something approaching genuine warmth. "Would you consider teaching my people about these partnership bonds that have made your species stronger than any military technology we have ever developed? Perhaps it is time for the Drakthul to learn that true apex predators are not those who inspire fear in others, but those who inspire such complete trust that smaller beings willingly place their lives in clawed hands that could destroy them, but choose instead to protect them with devotion that transcends species boundaries." Rusty opened his mouth in a wide yawn that revealed tiny fangs capable of delivering death with surgical precision, then settled back into Lucy's lap and began purring with contentment that spoke of missions accomplished and families protected through whatever trials the galaxy might offer. The chamber filled with the sound of that ancient purr, a vibration that carried frequencies of satisfaction and peace that had never before echoed through halls where fear and domination had reigned supreme for longer than most civilizations could remember. And in that moment, as storm clouds cleared and starlight painted new patterns across crystalline walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless empires, Lord Caven began to understand that sometimes the smallest guardians carried within themselves the power to change the entire galaxy, simply by choosing love over fear when protecting those who had earned their loyalty through kindness rather than force. The universe had become a more interesting place indeed, where apex predators could be measured not by their capacity for destruction, but by their willingness to build bridges between species who had never imagined that differences could become strengths when viewed through eyes that valued partnership over dominance in the endless dance of civilizations learning to live together among the stars.